Welcome to Module 101, Lesson 2. I'm Ayla.
I'm Emily, and we're your MyZone Master Trainers.
In Lesson 2, we're going to talk about the MyZone zones, the what, why, and how. We're going to start with a definition of the zones. You might be somewhat familiar, but we'll review it right now. The gray zone is between 50 to 59% of your maximal heart rate. It's considered a moderate intensity zone, and you earn 1 MyZone effort point per minute that you're in the gray zone. You might be in the gray at the beginning of your warm-up or at the very end of your cool-down. The blue zone is between 60 and 69% of maximum heart rate. Again, a moderate intensity zone, and you earn 2 MyZone effort points per minute that you're in the blue. A great warm-up zone, a great cool-down zone. It's also very good if you're beginning your exercise program to build a foundation, or what we would call build your aerobic base. It's also nice for longer steady state training or recovery training if you're an intermediate or advanced exerciser. The green zone is between 70 and 79% of your max heart rate, a moderate intensity zone, and you earn 3 MyZone effort points per minute that you're in the green. The green zone is an excellent zone for steady state training. Maybe you're going to go on a run, or you're going to go on the elliptical, and you're going to hold a steady intensity for a certain duration of time. It's also a great zone for a recovery zone when you're doing tempo or HIIT training, which we're going to define further later.
The yellow zone indicates 80 to 89% of your maximal heart rate. It's a high intensity zone. Now the red zone is 90 to 100% of your maximal heart rate. Clearly it's a high intensity zone. And for both yellow and red, you earn 4 MEPs per minute in each of those two zones. The yellow and the red zones, because they are so high in intensity, are wonderful zones for tempo and threshold training, as well as for high intensity interval training.
We'll talk a little bit more about those types of training in a moment. First, we're going to start with what happens while you're in each of the zones from a physiological perspective. The low to moderate zones, that would be gray to green. Initially, you're going to have an oxygen uptake increase from resting levels, and you're using largely aerobic metabolism during the low to moderate intensity zones. However, it's important to keep in mind that first you'll use your immediate energy system, and that there's always going to be both aerobic and anaerobic metabolism going on to a certain extent throughout the spectrum of intensity, more so aerobic during these low to moderate intensities. Stroke volume increases, and that's the amount of blood that your heart is putting out per beat. That's going to increase until about 60 to 70% of your maximal heart rate, or 40 to 50% of your aerobic capacity, and then only goes up slightly thereafter during exercise, so maybe into the blue and green zones. Cardiac output, the volume of blood that your heart puts out each minute, also increases in the low to moderate zones. Up to about 50% of maximal heart rate increases in cardiac output are largely due to stroke volume and heart rate. And then after that, increases in cardiac output are largely due to a continued rise in heart rate.
Let's talk about blood flow to skeletal muscles. So at rest, the blood flow to skeletal muscles takes up about 15 to 20% of your entire blood flow. The majority of the rest is dedicated to your heart, your brain, and your visceral organs. When we start to exercise, however, the blood flow to our skeletal muscles must increase clearly. So the blood vessels vasodilate. They expand in diameter, which allows more blood flow, and it actually gets up to about 85 to 90% of the blood flow. It's going to our skeletal muscles. The rest is shunted away from our visceral organs. In terms of our heart blood flow can increase by about 4 to 5 times higher than at rest, and relatively speaking, the blood flow to the brain stays about the same. In terms of blood pressure with cardiorespiratory exercise, we do see that systolic blood pressure increases with cardiorespiratory exercise. That's if you got systolic over diastolic, systolic is increasing, whereas diastolic blood pressure should remain about the same or maybe even decrease with cardiorespiratory exercise due to that vasodilation that I just mentioned.
Let's talk high intensity, the yellow and red zones. Obviously, our heart rate is continuing to rise in these zones, and we're going to experience higher lactate production because we're now beginning to engage the anaerobic metabolic system to start to supplement or augment the aerobic metabolic system. So we have more buildup of a lactate, and eventually it'll get to a point where we can't quite clear it out as quickly as we're producing it.
Let's talk about why these zones are important and why we should train in them. For the low to moderate zones, let's say blue to green zones, these are wonderful places for building an aerobic base when you're first starting your cardiorespiratory training program. They allow us to build that aerobic base by increasing our vascularity, so we have more blood vessels going to our working skeletal muscles. We also see an increase in mitochondrial density. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of our cells, so we need them to produce energy, right? When we have an increase in mitochondrial density, we see that our mitochondria get bigger, which allows us to use aerobic metabolism more efficiently. These are also wonderful zones to allow us to recover, right? After a hard workout, we've got to recover either during the workout as a recovery portion of the workout, or perhaps on a full recovery day when you're spending time in just the blue or just the green zones. They allow us to prevent overtraining in that way and also to provide balance to our training programs. The high intensity zones, clearly important, right? The yellow and the red zones. These zones push us. They allow us to become more fit by improving our aerobic capacity, or our VO2 max, our maximum oxygen uptake. They also help us to elevate our lactate threshold, which Ayla just touched on. So when lactate production exceeds lactate removal as a result of anaerobic metabolism, we're no longer able to continue exercising for very long. So elevating that threshold will allow us to push ourselves harder for longer. These zones are also wonderful to expend energy in. We're having higher caloric expenditure in these zones.
We've covered the what, we've covered the why. Now let's talk about how we can train each of the MyZone zones. First, the gray and the blue are moderate intensity zones. These are great for a warm-up and for a cool-down, as I mentioned previously. You might start in the gray at the beginning of warm-up and work your way into blue or green, and then in the cool-down you might aim to hit gray as the final point of your cool-down. These are also great zones for low or moderate steady state training, so you can hang on to blue for 20, 30, and work your way up to 45 or 60 minutes of steady state or continuous training. This is great for building a base, as I mentioned, when you're first starting a workout program, or you can use it as a recovery workout if you're an intermediate or advanced exerciser. And Emily was talking about the yellow and red zones. If you've spent a lot of time in those zones, it's great to dabble a little bit of blue or green for the next few days. Let's talk green zone. The green zone is an excellent steady state zone. You can hang out in green for an extended period of time. Initially, you might be starting to build more and more of an aerobic capacity as you're beginning an exercise program. This is also a great recovery zone if you're doing tempo training, or what we would also call paced training, and or interval training, where you have bouts of higher intensity and then you come down and recover in the green zones. Yellow and red zones. Threshold training, HIIT training, and I want to also define tempo and pace training using these zones. First, in tempo or pace training, you'd work your way into yellow or even red, and you'd hang out there for 3 to 5 minutes. Then you would come down and you'd recover in either green or blue, anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes before you take your next bout. That would be considered tempo or pace training. In threshold training, you're going to get a little more gnarly. You're going to go up into yellow and red, and you're going to hold it for at least 10 minutes or more. So you're really pushing your capacity, your threshold, when you're using threshold training. If you have a day like that, that's a great day to sprinkle a little blue or green the following days. And then finally, with high intensity interval training, which Emily and I both really dig, you're going to go up high into the yellow or the red, and you maybe hold that anywhere from 15 seconds up to 2 minutes, depending on your conditioning. And then you'd come down for a period of recovery into the green maybe, for anywhere between another 30 seconds to 2 minutes, depending on your work to recovery ratio. Thank you for joining us for Module 101, Lesson 2.